To understand the horror of the bar gunner, you first have to understand the math of the American infantry squad. In 1944, a standard squad consisted of 12 men. 11 of them carried M1 Garens, or carbines. They were the maneuver element. But the 12th man was different. He was the anchor. The official Army field manuals called him the base of fire. It was a clinical term for a terrifying responsibility. The entire tactical doctrine of the United States military relied on this single soldier. When a squad made contact with the enemy, the riflemen were trained to flank, to move around the side, and destroy the target. But they could not move a single inch unless the enemy was pinned down. That was the bar man's job. While everyone else was looking for cover, the bar gunner had to climb up to a vantage point, expose himself to the enemy, and unleash a storm of 30 to 06 rounds to keep the Germans' heads down. You rarely volunteered for this job. You were voluntold. The selection process was brutal and simple. During basic training, the sergeants would scan the line of fresh recruits, looking for size. They looked for the farm boys who had spent their lives bucking hay, or the high school football linebackers. If you were 6 feet tall and had broad shoulders, you were doomed. The Browning automatic rifle weighed nearly 20 pounds on its own, double the weight of a standard rifle. When you added the heavy ammo belt, the bipod, and the maintenance kit, the barman was carrying a burden that would break a lesser man. But the physical weight was nothing compared to the psychological weight. To be the barman was to be the father figure of the squad's firepower. In the chaos of a firefight, when bullets were snapping through the leaves and men were screaming, the squad listened for one specific sound. It wasn't the rapid times, brr times of a German machine gun. It was the slow, rhythmic times, chug, chug, chug times of the BAR. That sound was the heartbeat of the squad. As long as the BAR was firing, the riflemen felt safe. They knew Big Joe or Tiny was up there suppressing the enemy, buying them time to move. But if that gun went silent, whether from a jam, an empty magazine, or a sniper's bullet, the morale of the entire unit collapsed instantly. The squad would freeze, paralyzed by the sudden silence. The bar gunner knew this. He knew that 11 other lives depended entirely on his ability to keep pulling the trigger. He was the only automatic weapon in the fight. He was the anchor that held the line against the storm. And because he was the most dangerous man in the squad, he was also the man the enemy wanted dead the most. He was the king of the battlefield. But as every barman quickly learned, the king is the one with the biggest target on his back. The cruelest joke played on the American infantrymen in World War II was a small, rectangular steel box, the 20-round magazine of the Browning automatic rifle. To a civilian, 20 bullets might sound like plenty, but on the battlefields of Europe, where the currency of survival was volume of fire, 20 rounds was an insult. It was a fatal design flaw that turned the bar gunner's life into a frantic, terrifying cycle of noise and silence. Imagine the situation. It is late 1944. A squad is pinned down in a muddy field in France. The squad leader yells for the BAR man to suppress a German machine gun nest in the tree line. The gunner, exhausted and carrying 50 pounds of gear, heaves his weapon onto a fence post. He aligns his sights. He squeezes the trigger. The bar roars. It is a powerful beast, firing the heavy 30 to 06 cartridge. Asterisk. Chug, 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 chug. Asterisk. For a brief moment, the gunner is a god of war. He is throwing lead down range, keeping the enemy's heads down. And then, exactly 2.5 seconds later, asterisk, click, asterisk. That mechanical times, click times, was the loudest sound on the battlefield. It signaled the magazine trap. The math was unforgiving. The BAR fired at a rate of roughly 500 rounds per minute. With a 20-round magazine, the gun could empty itself in less time than it took to take a deep breath. While the gunner was frantically fumbling for a fresh magazine, his fingers numb from the cold, the canvas pouches swollen tight from the rain, he was defenseless. And across the field, the enemy was not This was the true horror. The German counterpart was the MG42. The GIs called it Hitler's buzzsaw. It was belt-fed. It didn't stop after 20 shots. It fired 1,200 rounds per minute, ripping through the air like tearing canvas. When the BAR gunner stopped to reload, the MG42 gunner was just getting warmed up. The silence of the empty BAR was the signal for the Germans to pop their heads up and return fire. Experienced barmen developed a neurotic obsession with counting. Asterisks. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Stop, asterisks. They had to force themselves to fire in short, pathetic bursts of 3 or 4 rounds. Not because it was tactically superior, but because they were terrified of running dry at the critical moment. They were fighting a modern war of suppression with a weapon that had the capacity of a glorified rifle. The reload itself was a dance with death. The magazine release was small. The magazines were heavy. If you dropped one in the mud, you might not have enough ammo for the next fight. And while you were looking down at your receiver, struggling to rock the new magazine into place and rack the heavy slide, you weren't looking at the enemy. You were blind. Many bar gunners died not while firing, but while frantically trying to feed their hungry weapon. They died with an empty magazine on the ground and a fresh one halfway into the gun, victims of a design that simply couldn't keep up with the brutal pace of World War II. They were caught in the trap, outgunned by an enemy who never seemed to have to stop shooting. In the grim calculus of World War II infantry combat, there was a statistic that officers whispered in command tents, but never told the fresh recruits. The life expectancy of a bar gunner in an active firefight was measured not in days, but in minutes. To the uninitiated, carrying the biggest gun seemed like a power trip. You were the heavy hitter. But to the veterans who had survived the beaches of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, carrying the Browning automatic rifle was effectively painting a giant, invisible bullseye on your chest. The problem was simple and deadly. The enemy wasn't stupid. The German Wehrmacht was composed of seasoned professionals who understood American tactics better than some American lieutenants did. They knew that a US infantry squad relied entirely on the BAR to move. Without that base of fire, the riflemen were paralyzed. Therefore, German machine gun crews and snipers were drilled with a specific hierarchy of targets. Officers were high on the list, but the barman was often number 1. It started with the sound. The battlefield is a cacophony of noise, but every weapon speaks a different language. The German MP40 popped, the MG42 ripped like a zipper. The American M1 Garand cracked sharply. But the BAR had a unique, slow, rhythmic chugging sound times thump, 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 asterisk. The moment a bar gunner opened fire to suppress the enemy, he announced his position to everyone within a mile. To a German sniper hiding in a church bell tower or a machine gunner in a bunker, that sound was a beacon. It screamed, "Here I am the threat, kill me first." Many bar gunners didn't even make it through their first magazine before the return fire, concentrated entirely on their position. While the riflemen could keep their heads down, the barman had to expose himself to do his job. He had to rise up to get a clear field of fire. In those few seconds of exposure, the air around him would turn into a swarm of angry bees as every German weapon traversed toward him. This reality led to a desperate evolution in how the weapon was carried. The standard issue BAR came from the factory with a heavy bipod attached to the muzzle and a carrying handle. In theory, the bipod was for stability. In reality, it was a tombstone. It raised the gun's profile, making it impossible to hide in the grass, and the distinct shape instantly identified the soldier as a priority target. Veteran gunners quickly learned to strip the beast. In the muddy fields of France, you would see BAR men taking wrenches to their brand new weapons. They tore off the bipod and threw it in the ditch. They removed the carrying handle, they stripped the flash hider, they did everything possible to make the heavy machine gun look like a standard M1 Garand rifle from a distance. They tried to blend in, to hide among the riflemen, only revealing their true nature when it was absolutely necessary. They learned to fire short bursts and then immediately roll to a new position, knowing that mortar shells would land where they had been standing seconds ago. Being a barman meant living with a crushing paranoia. You walk through a meadow knowing that somewhere in the tree line, an enemy observer was scanning the squad. He would look past the scout, he would look past the rifleman, he was looking for the heavy magazine pouch and the long barrel. He was looking for you. If you carried the BAR, you weren't just a soldier in the squad. You were the prize. There is a saying among infantrymen: ounces equal pounds, and pounds equal pain. If that is true, then the bar gunner existed in a world of pure agony. To the generals looking at maps in comfortable tents, the Browning automatic rifle was a tactical asset. To the man carrying it, it was a 20-pound steel anchor that threatened to drag him into the earth. The standard M1 Garand rifle weighed about 9.5 pounds. It was heavy, but manageable. The M1 918 A2 BAR weighed nearly 20 pounds, and that was just the gun. It didn't account for the bar belt, a heavy canvas harness with large pouches specifically designed to hold 12 steel magazines. Each magazine weighed 1.5 pounds when loaded. When a bar gunner strapped on his gear, he was carrying nearly 50 pounds of lethal machinery and led before he even picked up his water canteen, his shovel, his rations, or his helmet. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a pack mule. The physical toll was devastating. On the long marches across France, through the deep mud of autumn and the waist-deep snow of winter, the BAR gunner suffered more than anyone else in the squad. The leather sling would dig a deep groove into his shoulder, cutting off circulation until his arm went numb. His knees would grind under the weight with every step. While the riflemen could shift their weapons from shoulder to shoulder to relieve the strain, the BAR was simply too awkward and heavy to carry comfortably. It was a dead weight, a burden that never relented. Veterans recall seeing bar gunners collapse on the side of the road, not from enemy fire, but from sheer exhaustion. They would fall into the mud, unable to stand back up because the center of gravity of their ammo belt pinned them down like a turtle on its shell. This exhaustion was dangerous. When the firefight actually started, the gunner had to sprint to cover and shoulder the weapon instantly. Imagine doing a set of heavy military presses in the gym and then immediately trying to thread a needle while someone shoots at you. That was the life of the barman. His muscles were constantly trembling from fatigue, making the precise control of the weapon a Herculean task. Because the load was so crushing, the Army assigned an assistant gunner to the team. This was usually the newest or smallest guy in the squad. His job was to carry even more ammunition, bandoliers draped across his chest like a Mexican bandit, and to stay glued to the barman's hip. It was a grim partnership. The assistant gunner was essentially a walking supply depot. But he also lived with a dark realization: he was the heir to the throne. If the BAR man, the mule, was killed, the assistant didn't just grab his dog tags. He had to pick up the heavy gun, strap on the heavy belt, and inherit the burden. He had to become the new mule. The weight of the BAR shaped the physique of the American Army. If you look at photos of squads returning from the line, you can always spot the BAR gunner. He is usually the one with the 1,000-yard stare, slumped shoulders, and a physicality that looks both powerful and completely broken. He carried the weight of the squad's survival on his back, and every step took a piece of his soul. If you examine a standard issue World War II BAR gunner's belt, you will find a strange steel cup attached to the right hip. It looks like a socket for a flagpole, but it wasn't for a flag. It was the anchor point for a tactical doctrine so dangerous, so detached from reality, that veterans referred to it with a mix of dark humor and genuine horror. This was the mechanism for walking fire. The concept was a relic of the First World War. The generals in Washington, remembering the stalemate of the trenches, envisioned a new kind of warfare. They imagined a line of American infantrymen stretching across a field, walking, not running, but walking toward the enemy lines. The BAR gunner was the centerpiece. He was supposed to slot the buttstock of his heavy rifle into that steel hip cup, hold the weapon at a 45-degree angle, and fire around every time his left foot hit the ground. In the dusty training manuals, it looked heroic. A wall of Americans marching forward, suppressing the enemy with rhythmic, unstoppable fire, sweeping over the trenches like a tidal wave. But the fields of France and Germany in 1944 were not the training grounds of Georgia. The American GIs were not facing terrified conscripts. They were facing the Wehrmacht. When the concept of walking fire met the reality of the German MG42, the result was slaughter. Try to imagine the sensation. You are a bar gunner. You are 6 feet tall. You are ordered to stand upright in a flat meadow. You are told to walk slowly toward a tree line where invisible enemies are hiding. You jam your rifle into your hip belt and start pulling the trigger. The recoil of the 30-06 round is violent. Firing from the hip means you have no sight picture. You are guessing. You are simply spraying bullets into the vague distance, hoping to scare the enemy. You are making noise, but the enemy isn't guessing. A German machine gunner, lying prone and camouflaged in a bunker 300 yards away, sees a line of slow-moving, upright targets. He sees the BAR gunner, the man making the most noise and presenting the biggest silhouette. The German stabilizes his weapon. He aims. Walking fire turned the barman into a sacrificial lamb. It stripped him of his greatest defense, the ability to take cover. It forced him to trade accuracy for posture. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where death came from unseen angles, walking upright was tantamount to suicide. The tragedy is that many young, disciplined gunners tried to follow the training. They trusted the manual. They stepped out into the open, found their rhythm, and were cut down before they finished their first magazine. By late 1944, the hip cup became a symbol of how out of touch the high command was with the brutal reality of the front. Veteran gunners stopped using it. They realized that the only way to survive was to crawl, to fight from the dirt, to be a ghost rather than a tin soldier. Walking fire was a doctrine written in ink, but it was erased in blood. The steel cups on the belts remained, but they were mostly used to hold cigarettes or forgotten, rusting symbols of a tactic that sent too many good men to early graves.